O God, who knowest us to be set in the midst of so many and great dangers, that by reason of the frailty of our nature we cannot always stand upright, grant to us such strength and protection as may support us in all dangers and carry us through all temptations. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, we're back with Basil Hall, Presbyterian professor, English Presbyterian, very careful man. We're talking about Cranmer's relations with Erasmianism and Lutheranism. Talking about Cranmer's library, scholarship, and the languages. The books on Hebrew which survive from his library imply that he would have others. He must have also owned a Latin and Hebrew Bible, which include rabbinic commentaries and translation, probably being the useful one of Sebastian Munster as well as Paganini's highly regarded Latin version. He may have been able to appreciate the Arabic Targum of Onkelos and his Complutensian polyglot, which would also provide him the apparatus with a Hebrew lexicon, although he would need something fuller than this. It is also safe to assume that his ownership of a folio, a part of the earliest printed Hebrew Bible, Sokino, 1488, was not merely due to bibliophily, but to it being interleaved with a Latin version. His books were not a collector's idle hours. They were bought for use. While he could not have matched, for example, Sir John Cheap, that able Hellenist, yet he knew his way around Greek, for Cranmer's works contained Greek words and phrases which show clearly that he knew what he was doing. He demonstrated that Gardner misunderstood Erasmus on 1 Corinthians 11 on the eating of the unworthy at communion. He saith not in that place what you allege him to say. He also challenged him on his view of Hebrews 7 on Christ's priesthood by providing the meaning of the Greek term arabaton in Erasmus, by providing the meaning in answer to Gardner. He provided an English paraphrase from the Greek of the oration on baptism by Gregory Nazianzen. To own a number of works of the Fathers in Greek, as well as editions of the Greek New Testament, would be a pointless pretense if he could not read them. The absence of, for example, Chrysolaris' Greek grammar or other Greek grammars, and of Bood's lexicon suggests no more that they were removed than the dispersion of his library, as were the vernacular Bibles in English, which he could certainly have owned. Cranmer also owned various useful works necessary for biblical study. The Concordantiae Majores, Basel 1516, and a concordance published at Paris in 1527. His library ranged from the Mammaltractus of 1494, despised for its dull medieval simplicities by Erasmus, those 6 volumes of Nicholas of Lyra's Vulgate, with the 2 glosses and other commentary, as well as Vulgate edition of Cardinal Hugo, 6 volumes, to the commentary of Cardinal Cajetan on the Pentateuch of 1539, and the New Testament of 1532. He owned several commentaries on the Psalms, as well as commentaries of Faber, Stabulensis, Jacques Lefebvre de Taples on the Gospels and Pauline epistles, and that of Bucer on Romans 1536, which was dedicated to Cranmer. It had been considered essential to have the New Testament studies of Thomas Aquinas, and Cranmer owned them through Erasmus, who cites them frequently, often to disagree with them since Aquinas knew no Greek. How many of his contemporaries in England owned so considerable working biblical library with their marked passages. Matthew Parker, in his account of Cranmer's studies, added, with which learning trilingual studies, he opened up the most ancient fathers in Greek and Latin, investigated all the councils and antiquities up to the very time of the apostles, having removed what the sophists had drawn across the tainted skin. He cut back the whole of theology to the quick and expressed it in his manner of life, as in his teaching. For Cranmer, as for Erasmus, biblical learning was undertaken to find Christ as the way of life to be embraced, to be steeped in, and to be transformed. It was the Philosophia Christi. It also affected his teachings at Cambridge. Upon receiving his doctorate in divinity in 1526 and a university examiner, and in fulfillment of his office, he required candidates for the BD and DD degrees to be proficient in scriptural study. Stripp describes his activities, including rebuking friars who study lay only and school authors, whom therefore he sometimes turned back as insufficient, advising them to study the scriptures for some years longer before they came for their degrees, it being a shame for a professor in divinity to be unskilled in a book wherein the knowledge of God and divinity lay. Trilingual learning, leading to a profounder understanding of the Bible, was not only designed to challenge the domination of scholasticism, but also to lead to an increase of piety through Bible study and through establishing theological renewal on the basis of patristic studies, again, a leading theme of Erasmus. That Richard Croke, who'd been appointed reader in Greek at Cambridge and earlier in Paris in 1511, and seen through the press the praise of folly, an explosive challenge among other targets to scholasticism and its Aristotelian dialectic. Why not, wrote Erasmus, send brawling Scotists, adamant alchemists, invincible Albertists to fight the Turks? He mocked monks who would not touch money save with gloves on, but forgot to be so fastidious when it came to wine and women, and popes who thought explaining scriptures to be pedantry, prayer a waste of time, and shed the blood of Christians to defend the papal state. Beneath this mockery lay the serious purpose which Erasmus showed in his Enchiridion, where he approved of St. Bernard in his emphasis on the mystical tradition which turned to knowing God as against knowing about him, as was attempted by scholastics and their Aristotelian method. For Erasmus, Christ is not a logician, but one who offers the divine love to undeserving mankind, who should rely too much on the power of logistic method to demonstrate the meaning of human existence and how it is to be effectively lived, since our meritorious deeds can be a matter of calculation. Therefore, we should seek a pure heart in order to love God and our neighbor. Here is foreshadowed the devastating attack of Luther, who started from a different stance on trust in the merit of works and the Pharisaism of works righteousness. The emphasis on scriptural study based on the original languages, as well as supporting a life of piety, was in the program of reform promoted by Erasmus, to be accompanied by the study of the works of the Greek and Latin fathers, in part because of the usefulness of their biblical commentaries, as well as those of Chrysostom and Augustine, together with their theological methods. Erasmus and his assistants worked steadily in editing the patristic texts, providing the Latin of Augustine, Ambrose, Cyprian, Arnobius, Gregory the Great, Tertullian, as well as the magnificent edition of Jerome at Basel in 9 volumes. Perhaps the father Erasmus sought to identify himself most with the Jerome. And from Basel printers came the Greek of Chrysostom, Irenaeus, Hilary, Basel, and the 2 Cappadocian Gregories. All of these texts of the fathers were obtained by Cranmer and studied pen in hand. It was in this Cambridge period that Cranmer began to make collections of citations, scriptural and patristic, as commonplaces. Queen Elizabeth I saw them as a rare and precious treasure, which were to be so useful to him and to others later. Erasmus had urged from the beginning of his career as a writer that the study of good classical authors was essential not only for the improvement of Latinity, so much undermined by the barbarous Latin developed among monks and by scholastics, and for the graces to be acquired through the elegance and subtlety of Greek, but also to obtain and restore the dialectic and rhetoric taught by Cicero and Quintilian. There was a graceful and formidable logic in these latter studies which delivered one from being confined to the scholastic logic of the Terminists. Cranmer, as Fox noted about his studies, gave himself not only to reading Erasmus, Faber, and others, but also to these good Latin authors, to boni literae. As we can see from his library, these included a manuscript of Cicero's Rhetoricum, Erasmus's edition of De Officiis, and the Topica Cum Commentarius, edited by Valla, and Quintilian's Oratorium Institutionum, published in Paris in 1516, to which could be added among many classic texts the literary graces of Erasmus's De Conscribendis Epistolae 1523, Bode's Epistolae 1521. Cicero and Quintilian were Rudolf Agricola earlier and Melanchthon later in Germany. The stimulus to restored emphasis on rhetoric and logic, which Erasmus was using in analyzing Paul, and the young humanist civil lawyer was learning to apply to his method of commentary and theological argument. Over and above all these works, Cranmer possessed a large collection of Erasmus's writings in all their variety, thereby showing that he shared the received wisdom of the res publica litterum, the sodalities of humanist scholars from Krakow to Naples. Certainly a strong case could be made showing that for many years, Erasmus and the biblical humanists were a powerful religious and theological influence on Cranmer. Jasper Ridley, in his life on Cranmer, seems irresolutely to have felt, in spite of the materials that he gathered, that he could suggest contrary views, that he might be exposed to criticism if he did not follow the received opinions of many influential Anglicans, and offering from time to time depreciatory observations. This is especially true in his discussion of Cranmer's intellectual development, his theology and dealings with Henry, and those who held power in government. He described Cranmer's career at Cambridge, for example, as surprisingly undistinguished, and disparagingly compared him with Gardner, Parker, Latimer, Haddon, and others who achieved university posts. Apart from Latimer's sermons, who now reads or is aware of the writings of these former vice-chancellors and masters of colleges. Cranmer spent the length of a generation at Cambridge forging the tools of scholarship and the theology, which were to open new ground and lay foundations for the Church of England reformed. Moreover, where he had a choice, administrative duties were not tasks he sought for. Parker, who knew him well, was of a wonderful temperateness, gentleness, and placability, so that no affront or insult could provoke him to anger or retaliation. And those who were most hostile, whose force and power he took lightly, he often, by his humility, led to lay aside their hostility and become agreeable. Though not unknown among them, these are not the characteristic attributes of Cambridge dons, nor was ambition a weakness of Cranmer. Erasmianism gave Cranmer a thirst for biblical learning and its values in the practice of piety and a new appraisal in theology. And through patristic studies, it gave him the stimulus to inquire into the discipline, liturgy, priesthood, and ecclesiology of the church fathers. When he came reluctantly to power, the first energizing force in his earlier life can be seen flowering in his deeds and writings. When he was turning away from traditional Catholicism in his notes on justification, he includes what must have raised questions in his mind in the 20s, the statement of Erasmus on Romans 4, on faith alone, solus fide. Perhaps this encouraged him, among other strong grounds, to urge in the royal injunctions of 1547 that the paraphrases of the Gospels of Erasmus in English should be placed at all the churches for parishioners to read. Cranmer could write peremptorily to an unknown authority in 1534 to permit a certain Richard to have returned to him the Enchiridion in English by Wynkyn de Voord, and again in 1534, supposing the same to be of no authority or privilege, whereas Cranmer asserts that the king and council permit this book to all subjects. Occasional references to Erasmus are rare in Cranmer, and may be thought that they are insufficient to justify the assertion that Cranmer was a disciple of Erasmus. The large number of works written or edited by Erasmus in his library and the underlinings in them are part of the answer to this view. But it should be remembered that Cranmer was reluctant to identify himself or his church with one pattern or thought, reform, or theological views. He learned much from Erasmianism without conformity precisely to its patterns. To what degree did Protestantism come to break with that Erasmianism from which most reformers began? Was there a latent hostility here which broke into open in the division, the controversy over free will between Luther and Erasmus? It will be significant that Cranmer owned both Catholic and Protestant contributions to that controversy. Once Cranmer came to realize that Erasmus and Erasmians wished to avoid theological conflict, since Christ did not wish to create theologians but devout men and women, a view which led Erasmus to moral subjectivism, where Luther, like Cranmer, sought the objective givenness of God's grace. He would begin to move to more radical views, especially after he crossed the Rubicon of rejecting papal authority as usurped and corrupt. What particular matter brought Cranmer to this hostility cannot be determined. In a letter to Henry VIII in 1536, he wrote that he had said in a sermon, "I perceive the sea of Rome," just underlining it here, "works so many things contrary to God's honor and the wealth of this realm. For this cause only had I prayed unto God continually, that it might be separated from that sea." A Dominican prior complained, added Cranmer, of this sermon, saying that Cranmer had said, "These many years I had prayed daily unto God, that I might see the power of Rome destroyed." What date does many years lead back to? 1526, 1529. And what had occasioned this? To read the Julius Exclusus of Erasmus mocking a fierce soldier, Pope, 1513, could add to indignation, as would the many ironies against the papacy included in his annotations of the New Testament, but could not be regarded as requiring a revolutionary break, a break that Erasmus neither urged nor approved. More probable occasion for rejecting papal authority was Cranmer's turning to the investigation of all councils in antiquity up to the time of the very apostles, as Parker noted, placing this after Cranmer's study of the Bible and the Fathers. Cranmer owned, for example, a book of Jacques Merlin, which provided an analysis of the decisions of the early council, canons and decretals, which concerning the organization and administration of the church, as well as doctrinal matters, published in Paris, 1524. This is one of the most heavily annotated volumes in Cranmer's library, and marked by him to show passages or inclusion in his commonplaces. Here Cranmer found how very different the status of the papacy and its laws was in the patristic church from the later developments of the early and Middle Ages. To discover that the papal claims, the papal state, the papal laws, which were as binding as God's laws, had no valid basis in the early church, could well have been the fulcrum which turned Cranmer to break with Rome, since his mind was already agitated by the criticism implied or stated in biblical humanistic studies of the grounds for scholastic theological definition and the overreaching claims of canon law, as well as papal corruptions. After those marginal notes in Merlin, Cranmer might well have sought about 1526 the abolition of the Roman jurisdiction in the English church and state. A further stimulus to go further than Erasmianism was the emphasis the biblical humanists gave to Paulinism. Erasmus wrote a teasing paradox in the silent Alcibiades in his Adagio in 1515, and later editions describing those figures representing Silenus, which, on being opened and closed, a godlike figure. He uses this as a simile to show contemporary Christians admiring the externals of religion, however debased, and failing to see the goodness of truth underneath. We respect the mask and ignore the truth behind it. Christian values are covered up, and we respect appearances instead. The church, for example, consists of all Christian people. Instead of seeing this, we look at the masks of the church, who are the popes, bishops, and priests. And these pastors do not protect, they shear the sheep. For Erasmus, contemporary society was to be content with ceremonies, outward shows, and the appearance of piety in a friar's robe. A moral lethargy prevented people from finding Christ, and his teaching behind this reversal of values and reversal of the true meaning of words. Paul wrote of God choosing the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and the weak things of the world strong. Erasmus urged the Pharisaic masks of power and wisdom to be cast aside, to see the strength and wisdom of Christ. It was this and other aspects of Paulinism, for example, his teaching that faith, not merit-bearing works that justify, which pushed Cranmer beyond Erasmianism. The favored at tables was one man of Meaux, under its reforming Bishop Breconnet, was a supporter of this emphasis on Pauline exegesis, and wrote his commentary on the second epistle of Thessalonians of the subtlety of the devil, who appeared to a monk in the likeness of Christ, with a feigned company of 1,000 angels, and the monk fell flat upon the ground and worshipped him. See here how this foolish monk worshipped not the truth, but a counterfeit, as Cranmer or his amanuensis established the Latin for a confutation of unwritten verities. Here is Erasmus's point about the Silenus image, but there was more of this in Lefebvre, where Erasmus contrasted faith cautiously with ceremonies. Lefebvre, like Luther, and the young Contarini and others contrasted faith with works. Works at best can only prepare the way for justification. Here he disagreed with Luther. He also saw sin more seriously than Erasmus, as rendering man incurvatus in se. Here Cranmer could find a bridge in Paulinism, which would lead him over to Lutheranism and to the Pauline doctrine of salvation in the future, homily on faith. Cranmer also possessed books by Jodocus Cliff-Dove, including the edition of John Damascus of 1512, which contains Scholitis by Lefebvre. Creatum nobis esse et colendum singularique reverentia honorandum. And to be held in that respect, we give to the sacraments sentiments to be cordially approved by Cranmer, though with the support of the Fathers, in his preface to the Great Bible of 1540. Also, Cliff-Dove urged preferring the Greek manuscripts to the Vulgate version, a further bridge to lead the young Cranmer to regard the interpretation of penance, grace, and other matters differently from the received opinions of the time. Here Erasmians were influential, and we should not forget the powerful impression which could be given to readers by the prefaces of the Complutensian Polyglot Bible by the Cardinal Jimenez de Cisneros. However, it was Erasmus who sat behind the ceremonies which he regarded as Pharisaic masks, concealing rather than assisting the effective following of Christ in a life of piety, who no doubt first showed Cranmer, as did other biblical humanists he came to read later, the emptiness of many contemporary religious practices. When Cranmer wrote against invocations, praying to saints, worshipping of images and relics, with pilgrimages and offerings, holy bread, ashes, palms, and such other baggage. Again, never had the Jews in their most blindness, that is, following many ceremonies, so many pilgrimages unto images, nor used so much kneeling, kissing, and censing of them. And here we will have a break. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost. Amen.